Hello there. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. You're welcome joining me here in York. My name's John. I'll be your tour guide here on heygo.com for the next probably 45 minutes, I would guess. I'm not quite sure how long this tour is scheduled for. It'll finish when it feels like it's over, is the general answer. So welcome everybody that's just joining me last few minutes. Gloria, Karen, and Bethany. Is anybody on their first tour of Heygo? Do let me know. Give me a little thumbs up if it's your first foray into travel. Hi, Polly, on Heygo. If so, we'll orientate you, let you know how it works. But more importantly, we'll introduce you to your fellow travellers and make sure you feel part of a safe and happy travelling community. But I'm not seeing anybody give me a thumbs up. David's first one. Okay, David. So David C., I'm assuming you mean your first one on Heygo, not your first one with me. So please, everyone, just take a moment, say hello to David. Do welcome him into our community. David is joining us from Blackpool in the northwest of England. So fantastic. We're over in your way, David. Not so long back, looking at the illuminations. So you're very welcome. I'm glad that you found us. So without further ado, David, what you'll see is basically, you have been on live tours before. I will be walking around talking. I've got the gimbal. So we'll be doing a walk around York on the walls today. And obviously pointing out areas of interest, telling some stories, answering your questions. So if you do have points you'd like to kind of raise or questions, do pop them in the chat. I'll do my best to answer them if I know the answer. I don't always see them, so do repeat it if I've missed them. I'm not trying to be by difficult. Sometimes just whizzes past. And of course, I'm having to look out for other people, my own safety, good camera angles and so forth. So it's not necessarily a case of you pop it up and I see it and I don't answer. Simply is the case of it can take a while for me to be able to get to appropriate junction to answer your questions. So do stick with us. Other than that, there's a round circle in the middle of the screen to grab screenshots, to capture memories of where you've been, and they'll be all ready to download at the end of the tour. And of course, there's a button to follow me at the top of the right-hand corner, I think, which is where you can find out where I'm going next. And if you're able to leave some form of monetary consideration, that would be most appreciated. But other than that, do sit back and let's go and have a look around York. So, welcome one and all. We're here in a sort of sunny, wintry afternoon here in York. The temperature, I would say, is only probably about 8 or 9 degrees, so it feels sort of cool on my face. We've got lovely winter sunshine, which means we've got glorious blue skies. And so hopefully, from a postcard point of view, this is going to be a nice opportunity to going to grab some great shots of the city, of the Minster. But of course, what we're here today to look at is the walls. So for those that aren't familiar, York is both beautiful and cluttered with ridiculous street furniture. So let's get out of the way of that ugly sign so I can give you a proper look at our kind of first site today, which is Bootham Bar, the northern gateway to the walled city of York. And York is famous for being enveloped, being wrapped, if you like, in these medieval walls, first built by the Romans. The structure you're looking at was rebuilt in the Victorian era, but is essentially a medieval structure. The 3 statues at the top represent a mason on the left-hand side, a Lord Mayor of York in the middle, and a knight on the outside. So why do we have those 3 particular? Let me give you some zooms so you can actually see a little bit closer. Why those 3 figures? Well, Mason, of course, is about buildings. York is all about structure, about stone, it's about presence, it's about spectacle. The Lord Mayor as a seat of power, the controllers, those who, if you like, order the buildings, the constructions, the defences, and of course the knights, the defenders. And when we're looking at this gateway, it's all about defence. It is solidly built. Cheryl, I'm just going to turn us around through 90 degrees so you can get a vertical shot, which you can then reverse when it comes to looking at downloading your pictures. So do close your eyes to get the motion sickness, just so I can give you the full impact there of Bootham Bar. And what you can see there is a very solid structure. It has been, I'm going to turn this back around, been designed to withstand attack. The oldest parts of this gateway actually date, Cheryl's from this area, date from about 900 years ago. So this archway we're looking at here is from the Norman era. The Norman conquest of England, of course, starts in 1066. They successfully take York in 1068, and they build this arch around that time. So we're looking at something about 900 years old. The rest of it is about 700 years old. And it dates from the following the Battle of Myton, when it was destroyed. Now, I mentioned in the tour title, we're going to talk about William Wallace. And William Wallace, or Braveheart, has become better known, hasn't he, in the famous movie, Mel, can't think of his name now for a minute. The Australian guy. He'll come to me in a moment. And do remind me, my brain's a little bit of a pudding today. So Mel Gibson, of course, it's Mel Gibson. And of course, there's a famous scene where William Wallace, following the Battle of Stirling in 1297, arrives at York. He lays siege to York at this gateway, and the governor of York and the prince, the son of the king, stand firm against him. But of course, it's all too much. He breaches the city. He chops the head off the governor of York, and he sends it to the king, saying that York has fallen. It's a great story. Happened here, or rather, it's meant to have happened here, but it is apocryphal. It didn't actually happen. William Wallace, if he came here to York, it was in chains on his way to his execution in London in 1305. In 1297, 1298, he didn't make it any further, really, than what we'd now call Cumbria, the Lake District. But such was the fear of William Wallace and what he could do. He seemed to be almost invincible. It was enough to convince the city they needed to address the defences. They were seen as rather frail. So these days, the kind of comment is about living rent-free in someone's head when you kind of get obsessed with someone. Well, William Wallace lived rent-free in the heads of the English monarchs and the army. They believed that he was simply a kind of Superman. We'll just pause that for a moment, just giving you a view up on height. It's always nice to have a look across the square here, Exhibition Square. We've got the art gallery in the background, and in the midst there we have our statue of William Wallace. Not William Wallace, rather, of William... I'm all over the mess. William Etty, the artist, who is famous for saving the walls, a Victorian artist and campaigner who did his very, very best to save the walls. And just panning across now to our left-hand side, we have King's Manor, which is originally the home of the Abbot of St Mary's. So a beautiful cluster of buildings can be kind of viewed from up here. And it gives you a sense of the viewpoints that can be had, particularly down the road in front of us here. The A19, the Scots Road, the road up to Hadrian's Wall in the Roman era, but the route by which the Scots armies would come and attack York. And York was always the first goal in any Scots campaign. It was a royal city. There's a treasury here, a royal mint. There's a royal garrison here. So to take York really was seen as kind of really rubbing the nose of the English. So, just give you a little sneaky view of the Minster there, just a little flash of Minster in between to look down at a High Petergate. So William the Wallace never made it down here. But the fact is that road inside or outside the walls, Diane. So if I just bring you back round, Diane, which allows folk to come through, the road that we're looking at straight in front of us is actually looking all the way down outside the walls. So the walls, if you like, wrap around York. Now, that's not to say everything, all of York was always inside the walls. There was always development outside the walls. But this is, if you like, the citadel. So we're looking now down from the walls out towards A19, the North Road to Scotland. So that's the route away from York, but also it's the route by which you'd approach York coming in, if that kind of makes sense. So such was the concern about the force of the Scots that even though William Wallace had been kind of captured in 1305, there was still a great deal of concern about Scots marauders. And so following the dreadful Battle of Myton in 1319, when a bunch of clerics led by the Lord Mayor of York were killed on the battlefield near Boroughbridge, near York, this was all substantially rebuilt. So we're looking here at the internal of the tower, the defensive tower. We are looking at a structure that was largely rebuilt in 1319 in response to attacks from the Scots. So we're now inside, looking down along Petergate into the city. So we'll come around the opposite side, down from where we were before. And if we come down to this side, the signal does drop, so we can't dwell too long in here. But just to give you a sense here, you'll see that there is a staircase that once led us up to the top, so the guards could go onto a higher level to have a good vantage point. What's interesting is we come over here, now how well you can see. These, through the portcullis, of course, is a gateway of wood and iron that can come down very, very quickly to stop any raiders coming in, is there are windows here that are orientated all the way up the street. So consequently, from a defensive point of view, it's very, very easy to kind of spot those who are coming, because of course, whilst it's now very developed, lots of traffic, in the medieval period, this would have been open to the fields, as you might say. So consequently, it would be very, very easy to spot those coming along. If you didn't know who they were, are they raiders? Are they traders? You can quickly drop this portcullis gate as in front of us. So that will come down with a slam. It will create then a barrier to entry through the, the city gates can be open. This can come down and then create, if you like, this barrier. But of course, it's permeable. So because it's crisscross, you can hand papers, identification, pay taxes, whatever it may be. So on the one hand, it's both a defensive barrier, but also it's going to come through. So it buys you time. But let's kind of move on through because I can see the signal is dropping. Hello, those who have just joined us. We are just in Bootham Bar, so we're in the top section of one of the four main defensive towers of York's walls. We're looking at the portcullis here in front of us in a building that was substantially rebuilt in the early part of the 14th century due to the fear of the power of the Scots. It was during the Wars of Independence between England and Scotland, where for much of the time England was governed from York. It became a de facto capital city because, of course, it was much, much nearer to Scotland. So the kings were here, the treasury was here, decision makers, power brokers, armies were here. And so this was seen very much as the city for the Scots to attack. And whilst they never attacked and held the city, there were frequent raids took place. Coming down, taking captives, doing kind of smash and grab raids along the way. Because from a prestige point of view, obviously it was great to strike a blow against this royal powerhouse of York. But also because York was so wealthy, if they could take hostages, charge a ransom, get paid back, it could fund the armies to kind of live over the winter. So consequently, York was always seen as kind of fair game by the Scots. And even though that William Wallace had been defeated, his successor, Robert the Bruce, was every bit as effective on the battlefield. And so through so much of York's history, it was all about, I know beautiful blue skies, it was all about how to deal with the threat from the north. And of course, it wasn't until the beginning of the 18th century that England and Scotland combined to become one country, the United Kingdom. So in effect, you've got about 600 years where York is absolutely in the epicenter of this kind of titanic generational struggle for power between the kings of Scotland and the kings of England. And of course, you've got the kings of Northumbria in between the two as kind of power brokers, if you like, just deciding from time to time who they're going to support. So the border, if you like, between England and Scotland moves backwards and forwards. Places like Berwick-on-Tweed, Newcastle become England, become Scotland at various times. As these kind of campaigns kind of roll on and on. But as Becky was saying, got some lovely blue skies here. So it's such a lovely way to kind of get a vantage point of York is from the walls, because obviously it gives us height. And one of the problems that we sometimes kind of encounter with York is we can't get far enough away. I've expressed this many times on the tours, whereby I'm trying to get a good picture of the Minster, one of the other sort of streets. I can't get far enough back. There's something in the way. So consequently, the walls offer us the opportunity to get up some height so we can get a different kind of perspective on the city. So the walls wrap, for those that don't know, they wrap pretty much all the way around the city. There are three sort of gaps. Two of them are due to the river. You never built walls across the river, obviously. And the second was once a flooded area known as the King's Pool. But other than that, they form a continuous circuit around the city. And they give us a sort of sense of enclosure, of protection. They give a kind of a sense of very kind of tight control, kind of being enveloped, almost like arms wrapping around in kind of protection. So that overall kind of feel is about this sort of concentration of winding medieval streets within a very, very kind of tight core. And it creates a very kind of unique kind of ambience and feel that I think makes York very, very different to most of the places that you might visit. It's certainly the most complete set of walls that you're going to find on these islands. Of course, there are places across continental Europe, in France, particularly Dijon, is one that has got some fantastic city walls. But for the most part, walls were taken down. But of course, more than anything, of course, it gives these fantastic opportunities to view the Minster. And in comparison to the views from the ground, we start to get a sense of the size, the sheer scale of the Minster. So lots of opportunities for growing postcards. But let's kind of walk on. Because, of course, what it does do for us, it creates a magnificent promenade. it's kind of unrivaled because we've got this set of other. There's the Minster bells. You hear me? You hear those? The 2:45 in the afternoon, every 15 minutes. Let these folks go past. And Great Peter's was he about to toll? No, he tells on the hour. Is the second largest bell in the country. So I'm probably missing. Are the walls Roman or medieval? Well, they're both, Becky. They are both. They were initially built as wooden ramparts around a Roman fortress. They were then steadily replaced by stone. So by the 2nd and 3rd centuries in York, those. Do you want people to go past, by the way, in case you wonder why I keep stopping? So by the 2nd and 3rd centuries in York, we had a almost continuous circle of Roman walls. But of course, over time, they begin to wear down. They get damaged in battles, in sieges, and so forth. So the walls that you're looking at today are largely constructed during the 13th and the 14th century, so in the high medieval period. But it's also important to note that they were taken down, repaired and rebuilt during the Victorian era. So consequently, you've got, if you like, a Victorian rebuilding of medieval walls. But if you go down below, if you look at the ramparts below, so if I just drop my gimbal down the other side here, so we're looking inside the walls, underneath these mounds where you can just sort of see the kind of ground cover and the leaves, you're going to find the Roman remains down there. So consequently, the answer is both, if that kind of makes sense, Becky. I'm sorry, sir. But that's so typical, thank you, Paul, of the answer about York is because very little of it has ever been kind of totally taken down and replaced. What they tended to do was to adapt what was there for the kind of contemporary needs. So you can see that in buildings that have been kind of reshaped and repurposed. So rather than being taken down, they're rebuilt. They're built higher, they're built longer, they're built wider, they're built kind of different ways. They create new gateways, whether that be for defensive purposes or opening them up for railways. Over the years, the structure has evolved and changed. But in essence, it's all those things continuously. It's the kind of Schrodinger's cat, isn't it, of kind of archaeology, of architecture. It is both Roman and medieval and contemporary and Victorian all at once because it's been in continuous use sort of throughout the period. And that, to me, makes York a very kind of attractive place, that it's not simply attached to one time period. It's not simply frozen in the past. It's a living, breathing, evolving city that has been made to work for subsequent generations, whether those generations are Romans, whether they're Vikings, whether they are Normans, Victorians, Tudors, modern day people, whatever. We've all found ways to make York work for us, if that kind of makes sense. And I find that a really kind of delightful idea, that you've got this sort of simultaneous history and contemporary running kind of side by side. But enough of such things. So we're looking at the old Minster Library there in front of us, or rather the Minster Library, which is the old Archbishop's Palace. And the Archbishop, of course, is the Archbishop of York, is resident in York, and he is the head guy in terms of the. Hi, John. He is, of course, the second highest cleric in the Church of England. But the Archbishop historically lived here before he moved to Bishopthorpe in the 14th century, and that was his private place of prayer that you're looking at right in the middle of your picture. It then became the Minster Library, and the Minster Library, thank you, Len, became very famous, or is rather famous, because it includes a rather remarkable book. It is known as the Sinner's Bible of 1610. And the Sinner's Bible is a wonderfully unlikely story of misadventure that all relates to the reprinting of the authorised King James Bible. So the King James Bible dates from 1605, and by 1610 it was clear that all the printing presses had run out. They needed to redo another copy, and so an opportunity to do some redesign, add a few new forward, some new notes and so forth. And it was handed to a printing company that were based here in York to do that. And they printed and published this new version, authorised version of the King James Bible, all done and good, until somebody noticed a rather unfortunate error. And I think, actually, if I remember from previously, I think I've got an image, yes I have, that is just here. And I don't know how well you can see that, but there is a rather unfortunate typo right in the midst of the Ten Commandments, which instructs that they shall commit adultery, which is about as unfortunate a typo as you can possibly have. So it soon became clear, of course, what a ball had been dropped in this. And, of course, The church wanted to get back all the copies, to pulp them, to destroy them, but people weren't going to allow that, were they? Of course, these things became treasured. They were, just a common thing, isn't it, to get out after dinner and kind of show your friends. And so, despite the church's attempts to suppress and to destroy the sinner's Bible, it became this collector's item. And if you find one in a flea market, in a bookstore, then happy days. They now tend to sell for about £30,000 to £50,000. So you are onto a winner if you can find yourself a sinner's Bible. But as I say, of all the places to miss out a word, the middle of the Ten Commandments really isn't the kind of place that you do. But we're walking on now towards what we call Robin Hood Tower. And we don't really know why this corner tower is known as Robin Hood Tower, except for the fact that it's been known since at least about 1600. And the reason we know that with certainty is within the city archives. And New York is really blessed in terms of the physical evidence that we've got here, not merely in terms of the architecture and the archaeology, but also in papers, in documents, in things, that obviously from the city archives. And one of them is from a mason who describes doing repairs to Robin Hood Tower, and it's dated 1600. So it doesn't tell us why it's called Robin Hood Tower, but it does tell us that was commonly referred to in 1600. So, of course, it goes back a good deal further than that in order for it to be well known as such, right? So we don't know when it's been called Robin Hood's Tower, but we do know that's what it was called, certainly for at least the last sort of 400 years and more. And again, Robin Hood is one of these figures, isn't he, that we don't kind of really know. Was he real? Was he imagined? Was it a description? Was a robber in a hood simply a generic term for an outlaw? Was that, so in other words, lots and lots of different people that shared the same kind of characteristics, the same sort of criminal kind of codes? So was there more than one Robin Hood? We don't know. And if so, where was he? There's all sorts of arguments for Doncaster, for Sheffield, for Nottingham, of course, lots of parts of the country. So could it be that actually there is a series of Robin Hoods? Look, shot. That's coming up, Linda. The Richard III Museum is going to see that in a few minutes. So we don't really know why it's called Robin Hood Tower. What we do know is that the earliest recorded stories of Robin Hood, which are called the Jest of Robin Hood, are set in York. And that before Robbie's nemesis becomes the Sheriff of Nottingham, it's actually the Abbot of St Mary's that is his kind of bête noire, as you might say. So the bad guy. But he performs the same kind of function as the Sheriff of Nottingham, insofar as the Abbot is there throwing people off the land when they can't afford to pay the rent. That despite being a churchman, he doesn't display what you might call Christian virtue. He is kind of greedy, money grabbing, doesn't, have basic kind of human decency and so forth. And so the thought of robbing the Abbot of York and then using it to pay the rents, if you like, of the pauperised farmers seemed like a fair game. So it's interesting that becomes the kind of narrative of the Sheriff of Nottingham, but it starts here in York. But also, even though this was a time where people were undeniably extraordinarily pious in their faith, they were still kind of happy to accept a narrative that was all about a senior churchman, being greedy. So it does kind of suggest there's a tension between people's personal piety and what they see as the behaviour of the church. So this vantage point here from Robin Hood's Tower, I think, gives us a great view of the length of the minster. And for the first time, we were just going to take in the sheer size of it. The central tower right in the middle there stands sort of 200 feet in height. We've got the peak of the Treasurer's House, not Treasurer's House, the Chapter House rather, looking like a witch's hat, and the twin West End towers to the kind of right-hand side. It does give you a wonderful kind of perspective that you can't get from the ground level, as does this view over here, which is us looking down the moat. So along with the elevations, along with the structures and the defences, you've got the stone walls you can see up at the top-hand side. You've then obviously got a graded slope, so obviously you're going to come and attack uphill. Then at the bottom of here, where you can see the kind of the U-shaped valley at the bottom, that would have been the moat. And the moat, in effect, was a flooded public sewer. So it really was a horrible, kind of nasty, stinky sort of place. It's not really where you'd want to be. So you have to be really, really kind of dedicated Um, you wonder why they would call that tower in the Minster. Yeah. Um, so this is a lovely view that gives a sense of the moat and if you like, the complete form of defences that were available, because obviously that's first and foremost what the walls did. They provided this kind of ring of defences wrapping around the city. But also there's a kind of secondary, which is probably just as important, which give that kind of sense of arrival, a sense of importance. You know, it's not for nothing that York looks like this. This is the home and the fellowship of Christianity in Northern England, this corner of Northwest Europe. York is very much. When was the moat drained? So the moat was drained in the 17th century, Polly. That's when this area was created as being habitable. And what a nasty job that must have been. So as I say, you've kind of got this second element of function of the walls, which is that sense of arrival, a sense of place, creating a sense of kind of drama. So that, interesting, was the abbot involved in the story of Robin Hood? They call the tower there. Oh, interesting. We don't really know. Is the answer to that, Joanne? We just simply know. I've got a little image actually, I think, of the Jester Robin Hood on here. Yeah, there you go. So this is from 1495. That is the Abbot of St Mary on his horse, I believe. If I can't sort of see that sort of fully, but I think that you can. So whether Robin Hood Tower isn't mentioned in the Jester of Robin Hood, but York is, and St Mary's Abbey in York is. So whether the Robin Hood Tower comes from that time, it simply isn't mentioned in this story poem. Quite possibly, we don't know. And that's the thing is so much when it comes back, obviously, when you're going back, centuries, is the best, most honest answer is often we don't know. It may be at some point we discover a manuscript, some piece of archaeology that gives us lovely place to say, Linda, that will give us answers to these questions. But in the meantime, we can make informed guesses. So we can say, if by 1600 it was, widespreadly known as, not in my own words there, it was very well known as Robin Hood Tower, there's every possibility that 105 years earlier that it was known as the kind of same thing when this Jester Robin Hood was being written. But we don't know that for certain. But hopefully that's the best guess I can give you. Now, I did mention that the walls were rebuilt in the Victorian era. And so in doing so, they created these, what you might call follies, really. So this structure here in front of us, which I think is rather very pleasing on the eye, isn't original. It's a flourish. And that's because these were built or rebuilt rather, in the Romantic era. And so this was at a time when the Victorians were kind of obsessed with the stories of Robin Hood. Widespread, yes, awful, isn't it? Yeah, mangling my words there. At a time, of fascination with the stories of King Arthur, of Robin Hood, it's time of kind of Lady of Shalott, kind of La Morte d'Arthur, the pre-Raphaelites. So they were trying to create almost like a better than reality version. But at the same time, you've still got, in essence, the pattern of the medieval walls. It simply has these little flourishes put on it. I don't mind that. It's kind of valid that they loved it so much they wanted to add their kind of stamp to it. And of course, we're talking 120 years, 160 years later, whatever it may be. So it's part of the history of the walls. I don't mind it. I think it's just important to point it out for what it is. That it is a later addition rather than an authentic part, as you might say. But it also adds to the story, really. And of course, there's another very important chapter in this story, hi Lynn, that comes in the latter part of the 19th century when the council, the corporation known in those days, was incredibly keen to open this up as a promenade, to create a space for the well-to-do to dress up and to walk and admire the wonderful architecture of York, and as we're doing now, kind of walking along and just taking our time, taking in the views, looking at the Minster, looking at the inside of the city, the outside of the city. But of course, there were people down here whose houses were private, and they really weren't that keen on the likes of you and I, wandering up and down, looking into their gardens, disturbing their privacy. They rather liked the fact they had a section of York's historic walls at the end of their garden. So if we just sort of spin round and give you a sense of some of these houses here that we're looking at. That is in effect, garden of a house that kind of runs on. So why wouldn't you enjoy having some medieval wall at the end of it? Why on earth would you want to sacrifice your privacy to allow people to walk up down? Okay, Ina, goodies to join us. The bell is tolling for 3 o'clock. Look at that lovely shadow, the sun just going down now behind the minster, creating a glorious silhouette for us. Isn't that beautiful? So, of course, some of these people were dead set against this creating of this boulevard, this kind of promenade. And they took, it's fair to say, a great deal of convincing. Some might say bribery. So, in fact, the very last chap that agreed to open this up was a chap by the name of Gray. And we're about to see the house that he lived in. He's these days known as Gray's Hotel. And he was a solicitor. He held out very, very firm. And in fact, he took out a court case against the council to prevent them from accessing this land, to protect him from it being compulsory purchased. But in the end, he saw the light. He agreed to sell his property, which is this now, which we call the Gray's Hotel. He opened this up. Thank you, Hadrian. And with this section opened up, it allowed the creation of the promenade. Now, he became Lord Mayor of York the following year. So cynical folk might sort of draw some links between the two. I'd never be so cynical. But I think what you can see, of course, looking at Gray's house, which is now Gray's Hotel, one of the wonderful hotels here in York, is what a special spot this was. And you can kind of understand why he'd be reluctant to give up his privacy. If this was your garden, let's look down, would you want to sacrifice the privacy? But let's be grateful that eventually he did. You can see it's all beautifully landscaped here down. I think you're Rachel. And various features. So if you come into York, lovely place at afternoon tea. And the building that you're looking at here is the rear section is late Georgian, early Victorian. But actually the building itself is one of the oldest continually occupied buildings in York. And there's been people living here within this building since basically the Norman Conquest. It's just kind of like evolved over time. So it is at least 900 years old in parts of this building. I think the two together just form the classic vistas of York. It's often seen on sort of postcards and portrayals. As we come round, you'll start to see the end gable of the Treasurer's House coming into view. I'll give you another good shot here in a moment. So here's the plaque dedicated to Gray, who in October 1898 allowed this portion of the wall to open up and became Lord Mayor, as you can see. That same very, thank you, Polly. But what a view, ladies and gentlemen. It is talked about as one of the finest views in England. Medieval cathedral, shrouded by buildings that are not in any way consistent. There is no sense of an attempt to create a symmetry, to create any form of consistency. And yet the harmony between these buildings is, I think, quite stunning. There is nothing out of place. Everything adds to the overall picture. This kind of sense of kind of composition that almost as if by accident, perfection was created. I think it really is, a wonderful sort of spot. And as we kind of move along, I'll just kind of pan us from sort of side to side. You get different kind of perspectives because it really is a place that is worth seeing in the flesh. But I get that for many of you, either you're not here, or if you were here, mobility, getting up on the walls isn't as easy. So hopefully this is the next kind of best thing. But it really is a majestic spot. And the longer you spend here, the more you just kind of drink in, just as I say, the individual elements that make up. At first, you're sort of confronted by the entirety, the sort of the overall kind of shape of it kind of coming together. But the longer you spend looking, the more you can start to decipher and look at each individual element and see what it brings to the party and see the accidental alignments between kind of gables and windows and roofs and towers and minster towers and windows below. And it just adds this incredible, as I say, harmony is the best way I could possibly describe it. But it really is unbelievably pleasing on the eye. And Of course, as well, here's a living space. So we've got people gardening down here as well. Hello, Gillian. You're late to the tour, but you're arguably joining us for one of the highlights, so you haven't missed out. And of course, that sky, I think, is really looking quite beautiful, isn't it? Creating wonderful silhouettes for us to really drink in that very, very fine view of England. So let's walk on. It's getting busy again, and let's just enjoy for a moment. There's blue skies. Are there railings around the walls now? Yes, Melanie. Yes and no. Depends where you are. I mean, here, yes, it's quite narrow and you're high up, so consequently there are railings here. In other parts, no, but that's where it is much lower down, or all you can do is tumble onto the grassy bank. Whereas here, of course, it's kind of hard surfaces below, so consequently you could get a kind of nasty knock. So the answer is, Melanie, is some are and some aren't in terms of the protection of the railings, but it doesn't really bother me. I kind of know the bits where there aren't railings, and I've never fallen off the walls once. Will I read you do the tour again? Yes, I imagine absolutely certainly I will at some point, Vanessa. I've probably done this tour maybe 10 times or so during on Hago, so at some point, yes, definitely I will do this tour again. So we're coming to the end of this section here, the end of this kind of part of the walls. I just want to draw your attention to this study as gateway to Roman fortress. You can see there the helmet of the Roman legionnaire. And the reason that marking is there, and there's the variety of these around the city, is it's showing us the shape of the original Roman fortress. And this section of walls that we've walked today follows precisely the line of the Roman fortress. So the contemporary city of York is a good deal larger than the Roman fortress was, and so the Roman walls have been extended upon. So it's not every part of the wall was once Romans, but every part of today's walk on the walls is, if that kind of makes sense. And for those that have walked York, you may well have noticed on the ground little sort of brass sort of studs in the pavements. When you're walking along, you see those, that means you're precisely aligned with the walls of Roman structures, or you're walking down kind of Roman avenues. And this is surprisingly the way that the Romans, if you like, still impact on the way that we encounter York. So despite the fact that they left 1600 years ago, they still define how we interact with the city, because obviously they defined pathways, gateways, the main river crossing, and so forth. So the essential infrastructure of the city, its entrance and exit points, are defined by the kind of Roman architects and engineers. So they've not been here for, as I say, 1600 years, but still we feel their imprint. And as I say, if you have been to York, you may have noticed and wondered what they were, little brass studs in the pavements. They are lines, if you like, of kind of Roman heritage. So it just enables us to see and understand how we are and where we are in terms of the Roman city. I'm glad you're enjoying it, Linda. So we're coming up now to Monk Bar. So the second main gateway. We start at Bootham Bar, so half an hour ago. Some fence, yeah, absolutely. The kids love a bit of risk, of course they do. So this is now the northeast corner tower. Did the Vikings repair the wall when they were there? Good question, Joanne. So the Vikings, not well, sort of, but they were wood builders. The Vikings didn't really embrace stone, and that's why, archaeologically speaking, they are very, very difficult to find, because they mostly built in wood, and so of course wood deteriorates in a way that stone doesn't. And so because York sort of has a flourishing of both Roman and, of course, medieval and Norman, great stone builders, that's why we have so much of their built legacy left. The Vikings, of course, were here for 200 years. They patched up and they utilised, but by and large, they used wood rather than stone. So I hope that partly answers your question. So I'll give you a sort of shot upwards now, so you can look up towards the top before we start going down of Monk Bar. Another one of our kind of gateways. And the signal is going to drop in a moment, but hopefully before it does, you'll get a vision of quite how narrow and tight this stairway is. And the stairway about to go down, drops to the city at the ground level, is part of the defensive structure, insofar as it's deliberately very, very narrow. Yep, lovely small windows. Well, of course, you don't want the things able to fly through, do you? Thank you, Jeff. So, Dawn, the small windows help with defences. But just wait till you see how narrow this stairway is. And again, it's part of defences. What you don't want to do is allow attackers to be swinging weapons. You want to be able to kick them downstairs and so forth and restrict their movement. So it may disappear, but hopefully before the signal does, we can just get enough of a view. I'm just trying to film people. You just get enough. Look at all the wonderful markers. So as we incredibly limited. So apologies that I do just inevitable. We go down this very, very small, but hopefully you managed to get a sight of that before the picture disappeared entirely. I'm just coming around now to the other side of the archway, so we can have a look. And what there would have been on the outside of here, I'm going to turn around so we can get a look at the wall again. Is can you all see and hear me? By the way, I've not seen any sort of more recent chats. Is now fantastic. So we're up at Monk Bar, my favourite actually, the four kind of main gateways. And let me just give you a vertical shot. So close your eyes for a moment. So you can see there, what a majestic sight that really is. At the moment, we've still got our Christmas decks hanging down, so we've got our winter decorations rather. So I'll spin us kind of background. But behind those, how you can see, we have the crests, either side of the crest of York, in the centre of the Royal Standard, indicating your Royal Gateway. And this gateway was substantially rebuilt by King Richard III. So in 1483 and 1484, it was largely kind of rebuilt. It's beautiful, Dawn. It's my favourite of the gateways. And you'll see there's two doors there, which appear to be kind of rather suicidal. Walk out them, you'd fall pretty much to your death. But that's because, historically, they would have been what they call a barbican. With lights, yeah. They call them winter lights now, Polly, rather than Christmas lights. So they'll be there till about February. So those doors here on the left and the right, the ones within walkways, what they call a barbican, an extra kind of gateway, which would have come, shows, yes, of course, Jane, we'll do that. It's a good idea. So there were an extra, basically, single-story sort of structure running out here with a separate set of gates, about where those sort of traffic lights are over there. So you'd have a kind of a long tunnel, if you like, set of gates, tunnel, then the main gates. And what that meant was, in order to attack the city, you had to basically squeeze your army, your invading army, into a really small space. So what that meant is very easy to pick off an attack from above. So again, up here you can just see the bottom of the spikes of the portcullis, as we saw in Bootham Bar there. The wood line gateway that you can drop very, very quickly to help defend. You can see the grooves here, where that would naturally kind of sit. So got lovely vaulted ceiling. So Jane's just asked if we can have a look at the... Did you tell me, Jane, where you hail from in Yorkshire, where you earned your Yorkshire Rose? Or did you leave me hanging? I didn't see the answer. So Jane asked to have a look up the stairs, this time with hopefully a little bit more signal. So this is what I was talking about here, an incredibly narrow staircase. Literally, it's about the width of your shoulders for me going up there. It is incredibly narrow. But as I say, try singing... Oh, York Bond Red, fantastic. Try swinging an axe there. Try swinging a sword in there. You can't do it. Okay? But stabbing down, kicking down, very, very easy. So from a defensive point of view, it is dead easy. From an attacking point of view, very difficult. As some of you may know, castles with their curled staircases were often designed to prevent right-handers from swinging their swords by having the wall closer to their shoulder. So everything was about defence. It was about making it to very much the ability to kind of control, as far as possible, the safety of the citizens. So that's it for today. That's kind of this section of the walls done. I do the tour of the walls in 3. So I'll be listing the next 2 up. I used to call them parts 1, 2, and 3, but I no longer do that for the sheer reason people thought, if I miss part 1, I can't do part 2. And that's not the case. It doesn't matter whether you've been on the previous section. They're all individual. So look out for those. Give me a follow if you aren't already. I think the button is on the top right-hand corner. So do look out for that. Give me a follow. And I'll be listing in the next probably 2 to 3 weeks. I will be putting up the next 2 or 3 tours. And we'll go and hopefully again we'll get lovely weather, lovely blue skies, and just an opportunity to see York from a different perspective, which I think is lovely. It's fantastic from the ground level. It's a wonderful city to explore on foot. But equally, it's a fab place to see from above. That elevation thing just gives us something different. And of course, so lovely to see the construction of the walls and so forth. So thank you, everybody that's joined us. Thank you, everyone who's left a tip. That is most appreciated. Thank you, Noreen, for that lovely feedback. Do leave me some reviews. And do try and post up some pictures on your Facebook timelines if you wouldn't mind. Lovely to see them on the Facebook Voyagers group, but on your timelines or in groups, that's where non-users of the platform can find us. So let's get our stuff out there as far as possible, and tag me in, John Wright Guide, tag in Hago, and let's try and swamp social media with some great images so we can get lots of new folk coming on board. So welcome. Was it David C, I think, joined us on his first tour? Hopefully he's still with us. If he didn't leave us midway. We've enjoyed your company. Been lovely to see you here in York. And my name's John. And we've got some new joiners. Hi, David. Fantastic. Well, delighted you could join us today. Hopefully you will join us again very, very soon. And so I'm going to say goodbye. Do give me a follow. Taste of Italy. Where I Taste of Italy. Which one? Let me just feel that again. Miss Taste of Italy. What, this one, Polly B? Are you talking about, because if you like this one here, Little Italy used to be Giovanni's in York, and for years, Giovanni's was kind of like seen as the best Italian restaurant in York. But it's been a number of things since. So if that's what you're talking about, it is a very, very long tradition of being, kind of a great Italian restaurant. But as I say, under Giovanni, it really was a fantastic place to be. So, but of course, there are many other places in York just as worthy of your custom. So, brilliant. Okay, fantastic. Thank you, everyone, so much. I'm going to see you very, very soon. Thank you, Melanie. Goodbye from York.